Welcome back, everyone. I'm really excited for today's deep dive. We're going to be tackling a topic that's both familiar and kind of mind-boggling at the same time.
Yeah, this one is definitely a head scratcher.
We're diving into Perplexities of Consciousness, a book by Eric Schwitzgebel, and he really makes you question some pretty basic assumptions about how well we know our own experiences.
Absolutely. It challenges this idea that we have like this direct and unfiltered access to our own minds.
Right, like we often just take that for granted, don't we?
We do, but Schwitzgebel uses all these really compelling examples to show just how slippery and tricky introspection can be.
But what I found so interesting is that he starts with these really everyday sensory experiences, like stuff we think we know intimately,
Yeah, exactly.
like what we see in our peripheral vision or even the colors of our dreams, stuff like that.
Right, and that's what makes his argument so powerful, right? He's not talking about some abstract philosophical concept. He's talking about the stuff we all experience every single day.
Exactly. It makes it so much more relatable. Like, for example, take the question of whether dreams are in color. I mean, most people today would probably say, yeah, of course they are.
Right.
But Schwitzgebel points out that this wasn't always the consensus. Like, for a big chunk of the 20th century, a lot of scientists actually thought dreams were mostly black and white.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about that is that Schwitzgebel argues that this shift in thinking, this shift in opinion, might actually have less to do with any real change in our dreams themselves and more to do with the rise of, you know, color film and television.
So you're saying our cultural context, like something as seemingly totally unrelated as media technology, could actually be shaping how we perceive our own inner experiences.
That's the idea, yeah. It's this really thought-provoking suggestion that maybe the question of whether dreams are in color or black and white is kind of the wrong question to start with.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, he uses this analogy to novels.
Okay.
And he says, like, a novel isn't literally in black and white, right? Like the ink on the pages.
Right, right.
But it also feels kind of weird to say that it's in color,
Yeah.
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 A novel, it might describe colors, but a lot of the details are left up to the reader's imagination.
So are you saying dreams are sort of like color undefined?
Potentially, yeah.
Like the concept of color maybe doesn't even apply in the same way?
It's a really interesting possibility, and it just highlights how our language, the words we use, can kind of fall short when we're trying to describe something as subjective as experience.
Yeah, I mean, even something as basic as color
Yeah,
suddenly gets really complex when we're trying to nail it down through introspection.
absolutely.
It really does make you wonder how much we can actually rely on introspection to understand our own minds, doesn't it?
It does, and Schwitzgebel doesn't just stop at dream. He tackles visual perception, too.
Okay.
For example, there's this classic philosophical argument that a round coin, when you look at it from an angle, it should actually appear elliptical.
Yep.
And he points out that this idea, which seems, pretty straightforward at first glance, actually raises all sorts of questions about how our visual system works and how we perceive the world around us.
Yeah, that's one of the parts that's been really sticking with me.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm not even sure what I see anymore when I look at a coin from the side.
Hmm.
On the one hand, it seems obvious, like, yeah, our vision should get distorted based on perspective and the angle we're looking at things from.
Mm-hmm.
But is that actually how we experience it? I'm not so sure.
That's exactly the point Schwitzgebel's trying to get at, right? And he goes back and he looks at all these historical texts, and he finds that this whole idea of the elliptical coin isn't some kind of universal truth. It's actually more like a product of specific ways of thinking about vision. Ways of thinking that often rely on analogies like a flat picture or a camera lens.
So, again, we see this possible connection, this link between how we conceptualize something and how we actually experience it. So like our assumptions, our frameworks, our language, they might all be shaping our perception without us even realizing it.
Yeah, and he calls this flatism.
Flatism.
Yeah, it's this historical tendency to think about vision as this two-dimensional projection, like onto a flat surface.
Okay.
And he suggests that this way of thinking, this flatism, might have actually made people more likely to perceive, or at least to report perceiving, visual distortions, like that elliptical coin we were talking about.
It really makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about our experiences is actually just a reflection of, the language and the concepts we're using to describe them.
And this is where the history of philosophy gets really interesting. Schwitzgebel argues that the way philosophers have answered this question has actually been influenced by the metaphors they use to describe visual experience.
Metaphors.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So, for example, back in ancient Greece, the main metaphor they used for vision was like the impression of a signet ring on wax, like a stamping process.
So they saw vision as a very passive thing, like receiving a stamp.
Exactly. And what Schwitzgebel points out is that these ancient Greek philosophers almost never attributed distortions, like that oval coin, to visual experience itself.
So they thought we basically see the world as it is, no perspective distortions or anything like that.
Seems like it. But then fast forward to later philosophers who were influenced by different metaphors, like the stereoscope. Remember those?
Oh yeah, those old-timey 3D viewers. Had one as a kid.
Yep. So the stereoscope creates that illusion of depth using two slightly different images projected on a flat surface. Schwitzgebel thinks this emphasis on projection and creating a 3D image might have made these later philosophers more likely to think we do, in fact, experience those distortions.
So they thought we see the coin as oval because our visual system projects that image onto a flat surface, like the back of our eye.
Exactly. And what Schwitzgebel finds so fascinating is this connection between the dominant visual metaphors and the conclusions these philosophers came to about the nature of experience. Like, how much do the metaphors we use shape our understanding of our own experiences?
Yeah, it's like that saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. Or in this case, we see it as we describe it.
Right. And that leads to a broader skepticism about how much we can trust introspection. If we can be so easily swayed by these metaphors, even when it comes to something as basic as vision, what else are we maybe misinterpreting?
This is kind of unsettling. It makes you wonder if we can ever really know what's going on inside our own heads.
That's the challenge Schwitzgebel is putting out there. He's not saying we should just give up on introspection, but to be more critical and aware of its limits.
Like, don't just assume you know what's going on in your own mind. Question your assumptions, look for evidence, and be open to being wrong.
Exactly. And that's what makes his book so thought-provoking. It forces us to confront the limits of what we know about ourselves and to approach the study of consciousness with a bit more humility.
All right, so we've talked about dreams and visual illusions. What other surprising examples does he use to show the limitations of introspection?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. He brings up echolocation.
Wait, like bats and dolphins. Are you saying we can all see with sound like Daredevil?
Haha, maybe not quite like Daredevil. But we do use sound reflections to sense our surroundings, even if we're not always consciously aware of it. Like, think about how the sound of your voice changes in a small room versus a big hall. That's your brain processing echoic information.
Okay, yeah, a hallway definitely echoes more than a small room. But I don't think I'm consciously using echoes to figure out the space. It just sounds different.
And that's the big question. Are we aware of this echoic information our brains are processing? Schwitzgebel suggests we might be using it unconsciously without even having a distinct auditory experience of it.
So my brain might be mapping out the hallway with sound, but I'm not actually hearing it happening.
Exactly. He even points to studies where people, when blindfolded, can navigate around obstacles using echolocation.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Are you suggesting we're all secretly echolocating all the time?
Maybe not all the time.
Yeah.
But Schwitzgebel's point is we might be more bat-like than we realize. And this raises another crucial question about introspection. If we can use echoic information without being aware of it, what other perceptual processes might be happening under the surface of our awareness?
It's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our own perception.
Yeah, and if we're not even sure about something as fundamental as visual perception, it really makes you question how much we can rely on introspection when it comes to more complex mental processes, like thoughts, emotions, memories, things like that.
It's almost like he's pulling the rug out from under us, challenging this whole idea that we have this privilege, this unique access to our own minds. Like, maybe it's not as straightforward as we tend to assume.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and he goes even further with this. He even challenges this idea that we can train ourselves to be better introspectors, which has been like a cornerstone of experimental psychology for a long time.
Right. He talks a lot about Edward Titchener,
Yes.
who was this big figure in the early days of psychology.
Yeah.
And Titchener really believed that introspection could be honed, almost like you could turn it into this precise scientific instrument, this way to accurately observe and report on the contents of your own mind.
Yeah, he had this idea that you could really train people to do this.
Right, to become experts at introspection.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. He developed these really elaborate methods to try to achieve this.
Yeah.
Like, he had his students practice introspecting on all kinds of things. everything from like the subtle sounds that you get when you play certain musical notes together, these things called combination tones, to like, the after images that you see after looking at a bright light, like all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it was a really rigorous training.
Right, a whole system for training introspection.
Yeah.
And I remember reading about those combination tones. Like the idea is that when you hear two notes together, you might also perceive this third, fainter tone.
Right.
That's like the difference between the frequencies of those two original notes.
Exactly, yeah. And Titchener, he really thought that with enough practice, his students could reliably detect these combination tones, even though, they're not technically there in the physical sound waves themselves.
Right. So it's like they're learning to perceive this thing that's not actually present in the stimulus itself.
Right.
He saw it as evidence they were really getting better at introspection, weren't they?
Yes, he saw this as proof, basically, that they were learning to really see their experiences with more accuracy and detail.
Right.
Like they were really honing their introspective skills, basically.
But Schwitzgebel is pretty skeptical about whether this training actually worked the way Titchener thought it did.
Yeah.
He raises some pretty important questions. Like, okay, so how do we really know that these students weren't just imagining those combination tones?
Right.
Or reporting what they thought they were supposed to be hearing?
Yeah, exactly.
Because Titchener said that, his students' reports, they started to line up, becoming more consistent, more detailed as the training went on. And he took that as evidence they were actually getting better at introspecting. But you could argue that consistency in reporting could just be like a sign of increased accuracy.
Right. That's how Titchener saw it for sure.
Yeah.
But Schwitzgebel says, hold on a second, it's not that simple. Just because the reports are getting more consistent doesn't necessarily mean they're getting more accurate.
Right.
Like maybe they're all just converging on some kind of shared error.
Right.
They're all learning to report their experiences in a way that fits Titchener's expectations or the kind of the theoretical framework they're working with.
Right.
So how do we really disentangle genuine insights into perception from these kinds of learned biases?
Yeah. That's a good question.
It's a really tricky question.
It is. It is.
And this is like a recurring theme throughout Schwitzgebel's work, how do we really know?
Right. How do we tell the difference between what we're actually experiencing and what we've learned to think about our experiences?
Yeah, he brings up this other example, too, from Titchener's lab, this thing called the flight of colors in after images. Like when you stare at a bright light and then you look away and you often see this series of colors.
Yeah. It's like a little light show in your own eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Titchener, he had his students carefully document the exact sequence of colors saw in their after images. And again, he claimed that, over time, their reports kind of lined up more and more.
Right.
Which he took to mean they were getting more accurate in their perceptions.
But I'm guessing Schwitzgebel has a problem with this, too.
Yeah, well, he points out that, later research using more controlled methods, they couldn't replicate this consistent pattern of colors.
Oh.
It turns out the sequence of colors in the flight of colors actually seems to vary quite a bit from one person to the next.
Okay.
So it's possible that what Titchener was seeing wasn't really like this, increase in introspective skill, but more like this convergence on a particular description. A description that was more shaped by the shared training than by an actual perceptual phenomenon.
It's almost like they were learning a way of talking about the experience. Kind of like an introspective jargon.
Yeah, exactly. Like an introspective vocabulary almost, instead of really perceiving it any differently.
Right.
And this raises some serious concerns about the whole idea of introspective training.
I see what you mean.
If even highly trained observers can be misled by their expectations, by their theoretical assumptions,
Right.
What does that mean for the rest of us?
It's starting to feel like introspection, this thing that we think of as this tool to understand ourselves.
Yeah.
It might be a lot less reliable than we tend to believe.
Yeah. And it doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
Schwitzgebel, he goes on to question, another fundamental aspect of consciousness.
Okay.
How much of our sensory environment, all the stuff around us, how much of that are we actually aware of at any given moment?
Right.
This is where he gets into this whole debate between abundant and sparse views of consciousness.
Right. I remember this.
Yeah. So the abundant theorists, like, people like John Searle, they argue that we have this really rich and detailed stream of experience,
No way.
that includes tons of sensory details, even the stuff we're not paying attention to. Like, they would say, at this very moment, you're experiencing, like, the feeling of your clothes against your skin, the hum of the computer, maybe even like the faint taste of your last meal.
Right.
Even if you're not actively focused on those things.
Okay.
Then you have the sparse theorists who say, no, hold on a second. Our conscious experience is way more limited. Like, it's just focused on a few really important things at any given time. They might say, right now you're only really conscious of, like, the words you're hearing me say.
Okay.
And everything else just kind of fades into the background. So it's like two really different views about how much stuff is actually in our consciousness.
So where does Schwitzgebel fall in this debate?
Well, Schwitzgebel, he's not really one to take sides.
Okay.
He's more interested in actually testing these different views. Like, can we figure out which one is right?
Okay, so how does he do that?
Well, he actually designed this really clever experiment using, of all things, a beeper.
A beeper?
Yeah, a beeper to randomly sample people's experiences throughout the day.
So he's literally taking this philosophical question about consciousness.
Yes.
And turning it into, like, a testable hypothesis.
Exactly, yeah. He wants to see what's actually happening in people's minds. So the people in his study, they got this beeper that went off at random times all day long.
Okay.
And every time it beeped, they had to immediately stop what they were doing and write down exactly what they were experiencing right before they heard the beep.
Okay.
And he'd ask them about things like, were you aware of the feeling of your feet in your shoes?
Okay.
Were you aware of any background noises? Maybe a little ache in your shoulder or something.
Okay. So it's like he's trying to catch consciousness in action.
Yeah, like a snapshot.
Right.
He wants to get a glimpse of what their experience was like before they have time to, like, overthink it.
Right.
Or filter their response.
So what did he find?
Yeah, the big question, right?
Yeah. I mean, so is our conscious experience overflowing with detail?
Yeah.
Or is it more like, a spotlight just shining on one small part of what's around us?
Well, the results, as you might guess, they're pretty complicated.
Okay.
It wasn't like a clear-cut answer.
Right.
But they kind of pointed toward, like, a middle ground,
Okay.
What Schwitzgebel calls a moderate view of consciousness.
They're not super abundant, but not super sparse either.
Yeah, somewhere in between.
Okay.
The participants, they said they were aware of some sensations, even though they weren't paying attention to them, like the feeling of their feet in their shoes, which suggests that consciousness isn't always totally limited to what we're focused on, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But they also, frequently said they weren't experiencing things that, according to, like, the abundant view, should have been part of their conscious awareness.
Right.
Like, if you're really experiencing the feeling of your shirt on your skin all the time, you'd think you'd report it every time the beeper went off.
Right.
But that's not what happened.
So even something as simple as, like, whether or not you're aware of your clothes touching your skin,
Yeah.
it becomes this big mystery
It does.
when you try to study it scientifically.
Yeah, it's not as simple as it seems, is it?
No, it's not.
And, Schwitzgebel, he's very honest about, the limitations of what he found.
Right.
He knows that it's really hard to interpret what people say about their own experiences. There's always a chance that bias could creep in, right?
Yeah.
People might misremember things, or they might be influenced by what they think they should have been experiencing.
Right. And I guess that brings us back to this whole idea of how slippery introspection can be.
Yeah, full circle.
Like, even when we try to design these really clever experiments
Yeah.
to figure out consciousness, we're still up against this challenge
Right.
of how much can we actually trust our own self-reports.
Exactly. Yeah, and just when you thought it couldn't get any more complicated, Schwitzgebel takes us even further.
Oh, no.
Down the rabbit hole.
Okay. Deeper down the rabbit hole, all right?
With this thing called the Eigenlicht.
The Eigenlicht. What is that? Okay, what is that?
The Eigenlicht,
Yeah.
or intrinsic light.
Okay.
It's the visual experience we have when our eyes are closed.
Okay.
Most people would just say, it's darkness. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or like maybe some vague, shifting patterns or whatever.
It's something like that. But Schwitzgebel, he points out that throughout history, some people have said they see much richer, more complex visuals when their eyes are closed.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Like, what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Well, for example, this guy, Perkinjay, he was a scientist back in the 19th century.
Okay.
He described seeing like these elaborate geometric patterns, swirling colors. He even said he saw shapes that looked like trees and flowers.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I've got to say, I've never really, sat there with my eyes closed and, really paid attention
Yeah.
to what I'm seeing. I just figure it's darkness.
Right, right.
Are you telling me I might be missing out on a whole internal light show?
It's possible, yeah.
Right.
And that's exactly Schwitzgebel's point.
Okay.
He's saying, look, we need to question even our most basic assumptions about visual experience.
Okay.
Could it be that we're missing this whole realm of visual stuff just because we're not paying attention?
Right.
Or because we don't have the words to describe it,
It's like that scene in The Matrix where Morpheus offers Neo the red pill and the blue pill.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like, what if we've been choosing the blue pill this whole time?
Yeah.
Accepting this limited view of reality when there's a whole other world of experience out there.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And it really gets at what Schwitzgebel is trying to do with this book.
Yeah.
He's not necessarily saying he has all the answers,
Right.
but he wants us to be more aware of the blind spots in our own introspection, to question what we think we know about our experiences, right?
Yeah.
And to be open to the idea that there might be way more going on in our minds than we realize.
Exactly.
But how do we make sense of all this, variation?
Yeah.
Like, if some people see all these crazy patterns and colors when they close their eyes, and other people just see darkness,
Yeah.
how do we know what's real and what's just, imagination?
That's the big question, right? And it's one that Schwitzgebel really grapples with in the book.
Okay.
He actually used his beeper method.
Oh, with the beeper again.
Yeah, the beeper. To study the Eigenlicht.
Okay.
He had people report on their visual experience with their eyes closed whenever the beeper went off.
Okay.
And once again, he found a ton of variation.
Really?
Yeah. Some people just saw darkness or maybe like some fuzzy light fluctuations.
Okay.
While others were seeing these, really vivid colors, patterns, even specific objects.
So even the experience of darkness, this thing we think of as being so basic and universal, it turns out it's actually really subjective.
Yeah.
And there's all this variation between people.
It really is. And this raises a lot of questions, right? Like,
Yeah.
Is it because people are actually having different experiences? Are some people just more prone to, visual imagery or more suggestible,
Right.
Are some people just better at paying attention to those subtle visual things?
Right. It's tough to say.
Schwitzgebel, he doesn't give us any easy answers. But he acknowledges that this ambiguity is just kind of baked into the study of subjective experience. We're always going to be dealing with these layers of interpretation and potential bias.
Yeah, it's like consciousness is this ever-changing landscape.
Yeah, I like that.
And we're trying to map it out with these tools that are, themselves part of the landscape.
Right.
Makes you wonder if we'll ever be able to get, a truly objective view of our own minds.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how tricky it is to study consciousness. But, even if we never achieve perfect objectivity, doesn't mean we should just give up on trying to understand our own mind.
No, I think it makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, I think Schwitzgebel would agree with that.
Right. It's not about finding, the neat and tidy answer.
Right.
It's about embracing, all the mystery.
Yeah.
All the complexity.
The messiness of it all.
Yeah, the messiness of it all.
Yeah. So, where does this leave us? If we can't totally trust our own introspection.
Right.
And even our most basic sensory experiences are kind of up for debate.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to study consciousness in a way that's, rigorous and meaningful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's not that introspection is totally useless.
Yeah.
Right?
No, not at all.
It's more that, we need to be realistic about what it can and can't do.
Right. We need to be aware of the limitations, recognize that we can make mistakes.
Right.
And that our biases can creep in.
So we should always be looking for other ways to kind of double check our introspective judgments.
Exactly.
See if they hold up.
So it's really like introspection is just one tool in the toolbox, right?
Right.
Not the be-all, end-all of self-knowledge.
So what are some other tools or methods we could use? alongside introspection to get a more like complete picture of consciousness?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it's one that, researchers are still really trying to figure out.
Mhm.
There's a lot of really cool research going on right now in cognitive neuroscience, for example,
Okay.
where they're using brain imaging, to try to find the neural correlates of consciousness.
Right, to actually see what's happening in the brain
Yeah.
when people are having different kinds of conscious experiences.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's, this growing interest in computational models of consciousness.
Yeah.
Where people are trying to, simulate how the mind works using computer algorithms and stuff.
It seems like there's a real push to find more objective ways
Yeah.
to measure and study consciousness. Going beyond those subjective reports.
Right. That
I think-
Schwitzgebel is so skeptical of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing.
It is?
It's good to have those different perspectives.
It is.
But even as we develop those, those fancy new tools, those fancy new methods,
Mhm.
I think it's important to remember that introspection is always going to be part of the picture, right?
It is. It has to be.
Like, who knows our own experiences better than we do?
Right.
It's a question of how do we balance that first-person perspective with the need for objectivity,
Yeah.
and rigor in science.
Well, I think one way to do that is to think of introspection less as the source of definitive answers
Okay.
and more as a way to generate ideas
Right.
that can then be tested using other methods.
Okay.
So, for example, if someone says, oh, I see these super vivid images when my eyes are closed, that could lead researchers to, look for specific brain patterns
Right.
or physiological changes that go along with those reports.
So introspection becomes like a starting point,
Yeah.
a way of guiding us,
Mm.
but not necessarily the final word.
It's all about putting all those pieces together
Yeah.
to get a richer understanding.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, this has been really thought-provoking.
It has.
It's made me question a lot of, what I thought I knew
Yeah,
about my own mind. And it's kind of unsettling,
it is.
to think that even our basic experiences might not be as straightforward as we think they are.
Yeah, it's definitely humbling.
It is. But I think in a way it's also really exciting,
Yeah, I agree.
right? Like the fact that consciousness is still so mysterious
Mm-hmm.
makes it all the more interesting to study.
Absolutely.
It's like we're just scratching the surface
They are.
of what there is to know about our own minds.
I feel like the more we learn, the more questions we have,
Exactly.
which is a good thing.
Yeah, it is.
Keeps us going.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. But like you said, I think this is just the beginning of a much longer conversation.
I agree.
So much more to explore. Yeah.
And I want to encourage all of you listening to keep questioning, keep exploring, keep diving deeper into those mysteries of your own conscious experience.
Yes.
Because after all, like Schwitzgebel says, the most perplexing subject is often ourselves.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the perplexities of consciousness. Until next time, keep exploring